to ask you, but I'm going to start with some basic and some background stuff.
Sure.
And we'll see how we do today.
Yeah.
Tell me what it is that you do professionally and what your background is.
Well, my background is I was trained in anthropology and archaeology, and that's my PhD is in anthropology from University of California at Riverside. And for about 35 years, I've worked in historic preservation, which means basically in the United States working with federal laws, or in my case, working with federal laws that require agencies of the government to be attentive to historic places, archaeological sites, Indian sacred sites, old buildings, historic neighborhoods, and so on. And what I do nowadays is I consult and write and teach about how those historic preservation laws ought to be used and how people can relate to them.
And okay.
Well, back in the 1970s, I was employed by what was then the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands government up in Saipan. And I was there as a consultant to the High Commissioner on archaeology and historic preservation. My business was to help that government comply with the historic preservation laws. And so I was involved in setting up historic preservation programs all over American-administered Micronesia. In that context, I did a lot of archaeological work, including some archaeological work on World War II era sites in particularly Chuuk State, what now is Chuuk State of the Federated States of Micronesia. So that gave me a fairly unusual sort of background in the archaeology of the Central Pacific. When I came home, I worked for a small agency called the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. And one day, this fellow named Rick Gillespie and his wife, Pat Thrasher, showed up at the door looking for information on standards that might be employed to decide what kind of historic aircraft ought to be preserved as opposed to flown. And my boss at the time was a former World War II Marine fighter pilot, and so he and I were both very interested in this, and we got Rick and Pat in, talked with them, and tried to help them as much as we could, and both were rather charmed by this new organization they were forming and joined up. So a few years later, I was about to leave government in a huff, and Rick called up. We had talked periodically over the years, and Rick called up and said, well, we finally decided we may be nuts, but we're going to go after Amelia Earhart. We've got these guys who come in with a new theory and makes sense and think she may be on this little island in the Central Pacific. I was leaving government. I was fed up with Washington. I said, hey, you need an archaeologist with experience in the Pacific, the archaeology of the 20th century in the Pacific, I'm your man. And for better or worse, Rick said, okay, and here I am.
Sounds like, and so you've been involved with the. All right, and so is it the case then you've been involved with this project and TIGHAR from day one?
Well, not with TIGHAR from day one. The organization was formed, and Rick and Pat had it all up and running when they came to us at the Advisory Council to ask about standards. In terms of the Earhart project, yeah, pretty much since day one. I went on the 1989 expedition. 1989 expedition was very difficult, and we had a lot of interpersonal problems and basically, among other things, a falling out that led me to be away, sort of peripheral to the project for several years. Didn't come back to Nikumaroro until 1997. But I've been involved with the project from the start.
What were some of the difficulties? You don't have to go into everything, but like in 1989, I've heard different stories about it, and maybe if you could outline a couple of those things for me. I mean, it was the first expedition. You're coming to this very place, but it was...
It was the first expedition. It was the biggest, most complicated expedition that TIGHAR had ever run. there were, I think, differences of style, differences of expectation, uncertainties about exactly who was in charge of what. And those led to some pretty definite conflicts that I don't think any of us were quite mature enough at that time to resolve.
And where did it go from there? You said you stepped away from it for a little while, and then what got you back interested in?
Well, I stepped away from it, and Rick was very fixated on the grave that we'd found at Al-Karaimi South. And he said, you know, I think what's happened here, we go back to the kilt story, and people found the bones, they had to do something with them. What would they do with them? They'd bury them in a grave that was distant from the village so that the ghosts wouldn't be bothersome. And since the bones would be disarticulated, it would be a small grave, therefore this small grave on Al-Karaimi South is where the bones are buried. I said, that's nuts. You know, you're going to dig the grave, you dig the grave, you'll find a dead baby, because basically the people were down there setting up their land, somebody's baby died, they buried it on the land that had been assigned to them. I wasn't on the 1991 expedition when they dug and indeed found a baby in the grave, but in the process of finding the baby, found the shoe parts. I was still in touch. Didn't come on the expedition, but we'd sort of made up our differences, and we're talking and cooperating, and I was working on a report on the non-Earhart aspects of the archaeology of the island, what our observations in the village that didn't have anything to do with Earhart, but simply had to do with the archaeology of what is, after all, the last new British colony, new expansion of the British Empire before World War II. So we were in correspondence and talking all through that period. So they then went off and did other things for a while, more work in Maine and so on, and it wasn't until the mid-90s that they began talking about seriously coming back to Nikumaroro. And at that point we had made up our differences well enough that Rick asked if I'd like to come along on the 97 expedition, and I said, gee, don't throw me in that briar patch.
And so